Welcome to another Coffee with Developers. I'm here in a hotel room in Katowice, Poland, so hopefully it's going to be fine. But it was fine yesterday when I talked to Paul Kinlan about a similar topic that I want to talk to my guest today here. So Keith, who are you? And I heard you actually don't have time to learn React, and that's why I wanted to interview you. So
Yes.
first, what are you doing? And actually, why don't you have time to learn React? Everybody needs it, right?
Well, I'm busy doing lots of things. So I work at GitHub. I'm an engineer at GitHub working on the issues experience. I used to work on the design system at GitHub. And we kind of have these two flavors. Like one was written in Rails Vue components and one was written in React. But aside from my day job, I also participate in standards as much as I can. I think it's really important for non-engine implementers to participate in standards. And so I try and do that as much as I can. So I attend a lot of like the Open UI community group. I attend like WhatWig, which is the HTML working group, CSS working group, ARIA working group. And, try and help out wherever I can and sometimes contribute new things. So I work a lot in my free time on like hacking browsers, and I just did a blog post about that, about my 100th contribution to browsers. So yeah, I guess like with all of that, I just feel a little bit, there's not enough time to learn all the things I want to learn, and I want to kind of pick and choose more sensibly. And for my money, I don't think that React is worthwhile learning in depth. I think it's okay to have like a cursory understanding of it. And like, it's easy enough to pick up, right? Like as the rhetoric goes, you can learn React in a day or whatever. And I think you can learn a lot of the broad strokes of React or any other kind of framework, right? But they're very complicated tools and you can specialize in them. But I don't think it's necessary, and I don't think it's even that valuable a use of your time, especially because I don't think the frameworks themselves value your time that much. I mean, I see, a lot of these frameworks are releasing whole new paradigms, right? Like Svelte just announced this thing about runes in Svelte 5. React is talking about their React compiler, which is going to change everything, and you're not going to have to worry about use effect anymore or whatever. That to me is like a sign that they don't value their existing paradigms, or they don't value your time enough because you've invested all of this time in learning these things, but it's going to change from under you. Maybe that's why I'm interested in contributing to these browsers. It's a bit of a retreat from all of that because the browser code bases are very old, and there's not a lot of exciting newness. It's just like a lot of C++ and not much in the way of hot newness like the JavaScript landscape forever changing.
It is weird, isn't it? Like I found that in the later years, JavaScript, what came into the language was a lot of stuff borrowed from other languages, like from Python and from Ruby. And like then there's things like symbols, which I still don't know what I should use them for. And like it feels like that there was a heyday when like ES6 finally came out, and we finally said like, okay, let's get the whole mess that we had with ActionScript and JScript and LiveScript and all these things out of the way and standardize it on ES5 and then ES6. And then it started to like became synthetic sugar and like things that come in. I mean, there was async await that actually became a paradigm that actually was not in JavaScript before. It became a thing, and it feels like that we learned a lot from frameworks back then, especially in the DOM space. We learned a lot from jQuery, which we then became a query selector, and we learned that it's not as simple as we think it is to navigate the DOM in vanilla. And then we actually made that easier with like we also have like parent and neighbor selectors now, things that we learned from jQuery back then. But I felt the same when I worked with Ajaxian back then, and Ajax came out, and out of a sudden we had like 152 different JavaScript libraries that made Ajax easier. And then like 2 years later, there was just one left, jQuery, and the others were all forgotten. MooTools, maybe a bit more, and like these kind of things. But it felt the same back then. At least they just made JavaScript easier. But now it seems like all these frameworks try to reinvent the web as it is, whereas
Yeah.
browsers basically bend over backwards to make the web perform really well, no matter what you throw at it. And so I kind of understand that the investment that you think like you don't want to get locked into one of those that you might bet on the wrong framework that then goes away half a year later, and you stand there like the Flash or Silverlight experts from yonder, and
Yeah.
basically like, okay, what do I do with this knowledge now? So something that's standardized takes more time, but it seems like it's a longer investment for the future. So it's interesting to see that these paradigms always come and go, and a lot of times they come from a different environment than the web, and they try to be forced on the web, and it seems never to work. It seems like always trying to play catch up with the other systems.
Yeah, I think there's probably a bit of a kind of mental divide between some of the frameworks, and I do think some of them, and I would include React in this, kind of see like DOM as the wrong model, and their attempt is to try and fit their model into the existing model of the web, right? Rather than extending it, it almost replaces it. And to me, that's a misstep. But I think more than that is, I think you pointed out some interesting bits around like jQuery, where things that do extend can kind of be more easily folded into the platform. So like jQuery selector becomes query selector all, or Ajax, the paradigm of Ajax can kind of fall into fetch. I think those things that they seek to improve the web. Like they introduce new ergonomics on the same underlying kind of architecture, but it's a net improvement. It ends in a net improvement. Those things have to be modest improvements, though, right? We need to solve the web one step at a time, because it does take so long, because there is so much rigor and complexity involved. There have been discussions about like incorporating JSX into the DOM or into JavaScript. I mean, E4X was the thing that the specification that existed before ES5, which looked to incorporate XML into as like a native language feature. But it's just so complex, and there's so much to discuss and decide, and like so many stakeholders involved, that it almost is doomed never to be specified, in my opinion. So tools that make these rapid departures, like JSX, like React have, I think that they're never going to exist in earnest in the platform, because they kind of deviate from it too far. They step too far away. And I think there's like, we should still have that space. We should have that space for frameworks to innovate and experiment. I think what has been kind of concerning, though, is watching the rise of the predominance of React. I think it kind of came at a good time, where we were stepping away from jQuery, but we still had to find new tools to use to address some of the kind of shortcomings of the platform. But I look at the platform today, and it's totally different to the platform I worked on 10 years ago, right? None of the compatibilities are really a concern anymore. We have these projects like Interop 23, Interop 24, that the browsers are working on to make sure that there is this like cohesive platform that you can develop against. And so the issues that frameworks like React initially sought to fix, like they no longer exist, right? So it's answering a question from a decade ago that's kind of already been answered by the platform itself, and it hasn't really caught up with that, I think, and that's kind of the problem that I see with it. You're learning this entirely new system on how to build UI that it doesn't gel with what exists in the platform, right? It doesn't gel with the DOM, but it has all these workarounds that it kind of still holds on to. I mean, one of the little pieces I picked on in the blog post was autofocus. Trying to just manage focus in React is like a pain. And it shouldn't be, because the browser actually does like a whole load of work to manage focus for you, right? If you open a dialog in the web platform, like using a dialog element, the browser will retain the pointer to the focus element that was focused on before the dialog was opened. But I see so much React code that has these forwarded refs to store this kind of stuff, because there's not really like React doesn't give you this very nice way to reveal these parts of the platform underneath.
Well, it's a bit like when we reinvented hashbang to keep the state of the app in the URL, and basically before that we did that just with the URL, and now we have like view transitions, so we can actually keep the old URL model and still make it look like it's an SPA. And I find that a really interesting approach to basically put it in the platform that it doesn't feel like that it's actually going from one page to another, but it does go from one page to another, seeds the history, allows the black back button, all the things that we keep having to reinvent that was already in the platform in like one of these abstractions. It also feels weird that all of these abstraction models, when they come up, they always say like, oh, we make it easy for you in like 5 minutes to build your first prototype app. And they always talk about prototypes. They never talk about final applications. And then when it comes to like building accessible applications as well, and especially when you talk about focus, making those things work then actually cost you more time than if you would have started with vanilla to start with. But I can to a degree understand that when it comes to React and others, that there is a consistency in the syntax and the language of it. Whereas like newer features in CSS, when you take a look at like a Flexbox and Grid, and now like, I mean, I'm happy that we got nesting in CSS now, which is very simple syntax, because we had like discussions about having different syntax for that as well. But it feels like that, yeah, something like CSS and Grid explaining to somebody who works in a component world is kind of really tough. It's a steep learning curve, but that's why people go for these abstractions. But in the end, what ends up in the browser is HTML and CSS. Even if you generate everything with HTML with JavaScript, it's HTML and CSS. So you might as well understand what can be done. What frustrated me as a browser maker was that people didn't use the platform things, because those were the ones that we could optimize. Those were the ones where we could do speed optimization for you, memory optimization for you, because they were standardized. But if every framework did something different, we had a problem. So what are your thoughts on HTMX, which seems to be like just building on top of HTML and give all the other features that React and Vue and Next.js and whatever they're called bring in as well? But seems that was a flash in the pan. People weren't too excited about it.
I think HTMX is very interesting. I think that there's a balance to be struck between. I kind of see that as like the polar opposite to what I would call the typical way that people build React apps, right? This kind of like SPA style, very integrated onto the client. But I think HTMX is there's a silent part that HTMX doesn't really address necessarily, which is like the latency between the client and the server. And so I think that there's a lot of good quality UI will almost transparently hide these kind of details from you. And that's not something that can be that's not something that can be reasonably addressed in any kind of framework, I don't think. At least I haven't seen it. But the ability to hide user interaction, but the ability to hide like network latency behind user interaction, I think is really important. And that's where this balance needs to be struck, because HTMX effectively says, well, the server is where all of your state's going to reside, and you're just going to kind of feed HTML down the wire into the browser, which is kind of the right direction. But the problem there is that every click, if you're on like a slow network, or if you're a good distance away from the server, all of those clicks are felt by the user. So I think that there's a good place for more richer client-side interactivity. But I think in that space, that's where you can hide some of this like network latency. I think this is a very common thing in UI design in general. You can hide CPU cycles, you can hide network cycles behind animations, for example. You know, that 200 millisecond animate. this is a very common thing in game design, is this idea of like the interstitial loading. And so like in a game, you might see this animation that your like character is opening a door, and in the background the game is like furiously trying to like pull in assets from the disk or like render the new world in front of you, and you're just seeing the same animation for the 100th time. I think that is like applicable to UI as well, and it's especially applicable to the network.
So we're gonna have like cutscenes in GitHub soon. Like you click a button and then AutoCAD is doing a dance and like keeping you occupied while something's going on.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but I mean, we kind of have that, but it's like with skeleton UIs, right? And so it's like this very visible thing to the user. It's a very clear signal that something's happening. But I think that can be reduced by clever and tasteful optimizations of the UI. I think that is something. It's not necessarily intrinsic to what HTMX is offering, but I think it teeters maybe too far in the other direction of like, let's go back to like everything being on the server. I think there's a good middle ground, but I think this is where the platform has a lot to offer and is working up to those things, right? We see things like the new dialogue element, the popovers, all of this kind of stuff is really interesting. And it solves a really key problem for these richer applications that do need these kind of layers of UI and this interactivity. But hopefully it can solve it in a way that does hide those kind of transition points. I think view transitions is another good example, right? We can kind of like we're still facing that same round trip time, but we're just hiding it with a bit of an animation or just a way to like smooth the transition away from this stark kind of, delete the page and re-render everything again.
Yeah, I mean, the browsers did that with caching of interfaces already for quite some time. I mean, one frustrating bit, and again, thank you for contributing back to the platform, because one frustrating bit I had in Edge was like, I wanted to fix so many broken form elements, and I never got the chance to actually get engineering time to do it because we looked at the numbers and nobody used them. Like I mean, you can complain about like things like I mean, now we got select that's stylable, and we can put an HR inside the select element as well. So that was a big pain that people always did, but it needs like affirmative action from our side to actually go to our managers and say like, we want to fix that, because if it's broken, then people don't use it, and basically people don't use it because it's broken. So it's a catch-22. I found also there's a massive amount of like, and I talked yesterday with Paul about this. There's a massive amount of people that actually wrote like, so and so is dangerous to use. Don't use it yet. Especially accessibility experts say like date picker. Okay, here's like $3 in the date picker, and then until they're fixed, you cannot use it. Whereas like native controls in React have the same issues, but people don't have any qualms about using them because they don't know that it's even broken. So the discarding something because it's or there seems to be a fetish in the web dev community to basically find flaws in native components and then say like they're broken this way and that way and that way, and they don't even find a bug for the browser, and then you're like, how can we fix that? That's just basically a lot of people don't touch the web because the luminaries of the web say like it can't be used. So I think that's something we really need to stop if we want people to come back to the fold and actually do things natively.
Yeah. There's a lot there, isn't there? I think I agree that we can kind of quickly dismiss parts of the web because of a few issues. It's something that comes up regularly for me, is that like some of these elements, the dialogue element has existed since like 2014 or something. But it's only recently in the last sort of few years where it's gone through a lot of iterations to improve it. And it didn't exist in a cross-browser way, right? It only existed in Chrome in 2014, and I think maybe it was 2018 when Firefox started working on it or something. But there's been a lot of new work on it as people have started to use it. But yeah, there's still a lot that people dismiss around that, or select menus or form controls, because they don't quite hit the mark. I think there's a bit that the web platform needs to do there to make these elements more composable. I think customizable select or stylable select, that proposal is doing excellent work to kind of detach all of the parts, and that's where things like popover have come from, right? Is this idea that, what if you wanted to build your own select from scratch? How would you do it? What are all the constituent parts of it? And so we can offer the primitives at the same time as offering the kind of complete solution there. But yeah, there are a lot of cases. I mean, I said earlier, I worked on a design system. I've worked on a few design systems in the past where it's very easy to describe the bespoke needs that this application needs as a reason to throw away some of the existing web platform primitives there. But it does do a disservice to our users in some cases, because the platform will continue to mature, and the question is your design system, is your UI maturing at the same pace? Are you able to pick up all of the complexities and subtleties that browsers are implementing, all of the accessibility that browsers implement for these controls? Form completion, for example, is like a very complex topic that browsers can kind of handle pretty seamlessly if you let them. But we see a lot of forms that are kind of, because they're hand rolled, because it's a stack of divs pretending to be a form. We start to miss out on these features, and suddenly the web is a bit more broken than it could have been. So yeah, I think I would love to see people relying more on the primitives available, and maybe taking some of the compromises, or working with browser vendors to fix those. That would be a great step forward for me. I'm always going to put my money behind people that actually turn up to the standards. I see a lot of representation from folks like Lit, who build like Lit HTML and Lit Element. They turn up to the standards meetings, and so to me, that's an interesting place, right? Like it's maybe often joked that programmers like to kind of build themselves out of a job. I think framework authors should be especially motivated to do that.
Well, I mean, some of them were, and it kind of never worked out. I think the only one where I've seen it happening was PhoneGap. Like that. But then that was the only one where then just vanished and nobody needed it anymore, and that was really wonderful. It was built with inbuilt redundancy, so to say, if it's good enough across browsers to show that. I mean, today I showed required on stage. Just basically say like put a required on an HTML input element, and then you don't have to write a JavaScript that actually filters if it's there. And the first thing that people then ask me, like, yeah, well, how can I style that required messaging thing there? And I'm like, yeah, there's ways to override it. But then I actually pointed out, like, how do you want to style it? Like right now, it looks different on desktop, then it looks different on iOS, then it looks different on Android, according to what those people are used to. Like people on these platforms expect something to look like that. Do you want to control this all yourself? Do you want to design these different experiences yourself? And he's like, I never thought of that. Like, just wanted to control it. I just wanted to make like the perfect solution for it. I mean, of course, there's issues with it. There's like, you always have to have server-side control as well. I mean, my favorite is like when you had length that you can define, like the length of an input element, and you cannot type more than in it, but you can use JavaScript to inject a longer thing, and it would actually not trigger the validation. So there's a bug in there. But I mean that the joy of people wanting to put things in and wanting to control and design it themselves, not understanding that the web can be consumed in any environment that you can't control, and it should actually fit into that environment rather than try to replace it. And I found that very very hard for people to swallow, to like let go. You don't need to control it, then you're not actually in charge of it. But people are just like, yeah, but my boss wants me to style it. So it's really painful. When you also said JSX in the browser, and I also have Markdown people want to have in the browser, and I'm like, okay, which of the 15 Markdown standards do you want to have? Like jQuery in the browser was also a request back then, and yeah, all kind of stuff. So it's like, yeah, the standards are there for a reason, and they take a long time to standardize because they have to think of lots of contingencies that you haven't thought of. Now, one thing that I found wondering about React is like there's React and React Native. So the idea of a lot of these frameworks is you can build something for the web, but also native platform, native apps with it. So they see HTML as a compilation target. Do you think that's something that people really believe, or do you think that's something that is just, yeah, it's a nice to have, but it gives a bad experience on all platforms?
Yeah, I haven't really seen like a particularly compelling use case for this. I haven't spent that much time in the mobile space, but I have quite a few friends and peers who do. And a lot of the time it's either native or it's a web view. I can't see where the value add is for something like React Native. But I'm sure there are a lot of people building with it and doing great stuff with it. But if you're not building native and you're not building for the web, like what is the point? I guess you're accepting this halfway ground between the two. I've never personally seen a successful application that leverages the idea of React Native appearing on both the web and on mobile. Like I say, a web view is just so easy to put together, and you can just render HTML, and you might be using React behind the scenes there, but that's not React Native, right? That's just like React outputting HTML.
What drives me bonkers is when people build apps and use their own internal browsers to basically to have
Yeah,
control over all the data. And it's normally like a 15th generation outdated Chromium somewhere in there. And more annoyingly, I'm happy to store my passwords and information and autofill in my browser. But every time I go from Facebook to a website, it opens in the Facebook browser and none of the autofill works because it's all in my Edge browser. And it's
yeah,
just like this extra control is just driving me nuts. And it seems like a lot of people were happy to include their own browser with their app just so they can spy on you. I don't know why they do it, but it feels like that's a pattern that needs to be broken to a degree as well, because like there is a browser on the operating system that the user chose. It's far easier for them to order something on your website because all that data is being pre-filled. But people are still like, oh, why don't you enter that data here again? You're like, no, I don't want to.
yeah. It's kind of wild. I it the dream of PWAs that was sold to us, I think, there's a narrative there that like the kind of arbiters of these platforms have kind of tried to prevent that from happening. Maybe there's some truth there, but yeah, I kind of yearn for the idea that was sold in, like, I don't know, the 2015s, that we could just have these web apps installed on our phone and they would all just use the built-in browser, like whatever browser we wanted to pick, um, and they would just operate like native apps. But yeah, we've kind of stepped far away from there, I feel, which is a shame.
One big discussion there was lately a big drama, and I was on vacation, so I'm happy I didn't follow all of it. Was the whole like web components are not good enough, and native components solve all the other problems. So where do you think we are on that in that regard? I think that was just really bizarre. It seems like there's a lot of developers that actually started a component world because they came from, I don't know, native development and actually think the web is a componentized thing rather than a page level paradigm. But it seems we have to make those people happy, but at the same time, what we did with web components is not good enough, and I still don't understand what the problem was.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of complexity in web components. I think that um, they do change some of the existing paradigms, which does make things a little more awkward. Like Shadow DOM is a departure from uh, just regular HTML, I guess, or light DOM. There's some learning curves there, so like the web platform isn't immune to this kind of shifting of the tectonic layers either, right? Yeah, the drama was around this idea that web components are this kind of exclusive or in isolation tax on framework authors. I don't know. Personally, I don't buy it. I understand the points that were being made, but to me, it's like they are an intrinsic part of the platform and they're not going away anytime soon. People find use for them, but like everything, a framework's job seems to be to make the developer's life easier. I don't see how taking a particular stance on one particular platform technology over another makes developers' lives easier. Like, I don't want my framework having opinions about fetch. I don't want my framework having opinions about BF cache. Why would I want my framework having opinions about web components? Maybe they're a bit of a straw man, or at least a punching bag. But yeah, I did a talk a while ago about bad parts of web components because I am an eternal pessimist. But I do think web components are good. I think they're a useful technology. We're seeing more and more increased adoption of web components, and I think that there's a good reason for that. They do provide that kind of interoperable layer, and they don't provide everything a framework does, but I don't think that everything that frameworks give you is necessary for all of the time, right? We don't need state management for these small like independent components. They don't need to opt into centralized state management, or they don't need a context provider, or any of these other things that the frameworks offer you. So there's a place for them, and they fit in. I wish people would embrace them more.
An eternal pessimist from England. I never heard about that. That's a very strange
Right.
one. It's weird. One thing that actually always rubbed me the wrong way, and I mean, I talked to Jeremy Keith about this on stage several times. It's like I wrote this unobtrusive JavaScript course in 2000 where I basically said, like, progressive enhancement, make sure that your JavaScript is never in the way, put all the styling in your CSS, put a class on top of something and use the CSS to define it rather than doing inline styles. And then we get JSX, and then we get things like Tailwind, and we kind of like paint with markup again. And it feels to me so weird that we're actually that it seems to be such a hard sell to make people understand that the separation of concerns is not something that because we hate you, but it's actually something to make it easier for you to maintain something that you've created half a year ago, and you go back to it and you still to understand it. But it seems like, especially with the success of Tailwind, I still don't understand it. People that said, like, I work in TypeScript, I work in React, so Tailwind makes me really, really effective. But learning all these shortcut CSS names, that reminds me of BEM or other systems that we had before. And I'm like, why do I need this when I actually could have it in like readable CSS syntax? Or am I just being a dreamer and I think CSS is readable?
I mean, what's old is new, I think, right? Like a lot of these, I often joke, like, nothing good has been invented since the 1970s. Like, all of the foundational problems were resolved in white papers and conferences in the 1970s. But no, yeah, I agree in part. Like, I kind of see some of the value in Tailwind. I think a lot of the value, like a lot of these tools talk about developer experience, which is this very kind of weird nebulous term. And kind of what I've pinned it down to, as far as I can see, is IDE completions and go to definition, which is like something that I think has been underinvested in for a long time in the world of like dynamic languages and maybe markup languages like HTML and CSS. So having good auto completions, I think, does actually help a lot of developers. I think that's where the value out of Tailwind comes in, because the idea that you can pick from a list of things and hopefully get the right one is maybe comforting. But yeah, I got into an argument recently on Twitter because someone was pointing out how good Tailwind's innovation of logical properties are, and I had to explain to them that is actually something that was specified in CSS that Tailwind has picked up. Like, turns out the innovation was in CSS all along. Who knew? But yeah, this is, I think, intrinsic to the problem we face as an industry, is that people are so far removed from the underlying platform that they can't actually see it change for the better, or they can't see the changes that happen in front of them. there's a lot of like libraries with something like React that wrap things like D3 or WebGL. And it's like, look what React can do. We can render 3D graphics. It's like, no, the web platform can render 3D graphics. You've just implemented a wrapper around it, which is great. Like, I would love to see more people get involved in 3D graphics. That's wonderful. But yeah, like it's the operating system that we call the browser that's behind all of that, right? That's the kind of person behind the curtain, so to speak.
There were a few in the past. I remember when Canvas was the first one to give you hardware acceleration, because then basically we in Mozilla, we did like Bespin, the text editor that was Canvas based, where we had to reinvent copy and paste because there was no DOM. You couldn't actually find a range in there. Not that the range standard is really good. That's something we need to fix as well. But Flutter also uses Canvas under the hood, I think, and now Google Sheets is using Canvas to actually render, because they needed like 50,000 lines of data being scrolling at 120 frames per second. So there is always things that feel like there, and it's fun how these discussions back then when Canvas came out, and like reinventing applets, if you think about it. But now you see WASM things where people basically really reinvent applets and put like all kind of C++ code in the browser through using WASM. It's interesting to see that that there is platform things that other people then sell better by putting an API on top of it or something. But yeah, D3.js is an abstraction as well. The same with like Babylon.js used to be is one that is used inside Microsoft and a lot of stuff. I wonder. I mean, going full circle back to your thing, what we should invest in as developers to learn things. It seems like the abstraction bit is the siren song of making it more effective upfront will yield some extra cost later on. So understanding the platform underneath at least is something that is never a wasted investment, or do you think that's something we cannot tell young folk to actually get them on our side?
The crux of the post that I was trying to kind of get to was I think that we are in a really competitive market at the moment. There's a lot of new developers coming in. I interview a lot of candidates, and I see a lot of folk, pretty much everyone who comes through to at least that I end up interviewing, they know some level of the frameworks like React. And so they've kind of done the requisite part to get through the door, I guess. But there's only so many slots to fill, right? And so for better or worse, the market looks for like how you can differentiate yourself. And so I speak with a lot of junior developers or early stage developers who are asking, like, what do I do? How can I differentiate myself? And the classic answer there is, well, specialize, right? But where do you specialize? And this is where I do think knocking one layer off of the stack of abstractions that you're working on can be a useful and rewarding experience. And it's what I do all the time. Like, you can always go one layer further down, right? If you're working in a dynamic language, look at typed languages and try and figure out how they work, and try and figure out how what the dynamic language is offering you. Where is the value add and where are the pitfalls? Because it will make you a better developer of dynamic languages. Similarly, try looking, if you're like a systems engineer, look at more assembly, because that's the layer below and it will teach you things, right? I'm not saying that like if you can't read assembly, you're not going to make it. But I am saying that like every time you peek below, you're going to learn new things. It is part of what I consider to be at least a healthy enthusiasm for the topic. And I think that that's probably what a lot of interviewers end up selecting for. And maybe that's, not a great thing for some people. But I think at the end of the day, if you're looking for the next stage to like the next piece to differentiate yourself, like there are some avenues, right? Specializing in UI, specializing in accessibility, specializing in performance, they are great ways to level up your career and also kind of provide value for the companies that you go to work for. accessibility, for example, is an area that is often incredibly underserved. It requires a lot of passion to get involved in, but it's also something that, like, with the EU regulations coming in 25, we're going to see kind of some real motivation for, because the people who didn't care because they are only interested in the bottom line, well, suddenly their bottom line is going to be affected by things like the European accessibility initiatives. So I think that there is a space for folks to specialize there, become good at accessibility, and like pave your path there. I think, yeah, the same is true for performance, right? Alex Russell talks a lot about how the market is not getting faster CPUs, it's just getting more of the slower CPUs. You know, the bottom of the market is pretty much flat. So there's going to be a lot of people coming online. I think over the kind of COVID period, 2020 to 2024, we saw like a third of the world, or a third of the internet, come online in that period. So there's a lot of new people online, and I think we're going to see the same again. You know, the web continues to grow, the internet continues to grow. We're going to see a lot of new people come online, and they're not always going to be using an iPhone. And so I think a lot of work will need to be done to make sure that the web performs properly for those people. So yeah, I think performance is a great specialization to get into. Learning those tools, learning how to make code performant is a really good way to differentiate yourselves from the other engineers in the hiring pool. There are a lot of specifications, there are a lot of texts to read, there are a lot of guidelines to read, and they will, you know, some of them are incredibly tedious to read or incredibly boring, but they're also really useful. If you can learn how something actually works and you can put it into practice, that differentiates you from the others, right?
Excellent. I think that's good. It's a good time as any to end with this, because there's so much to learn from this, and I'm going to work through the transcript and write a blog post about it. And like, it's I think there is, yeah, it is. It feels like we've seen so much, and we've seen so much come and go, that it feels like, oh, why do I put my effort into that? But yeah, it's the siren song of being like very effective by using abstractions. In the end, will come back to you, and you will actually have to find a way to not just be latch onto the one thing that is hot right now. And I think it's interesting because boot camps used to do that. Basically, you could take the flavor of the month framework, and you basically get a $3,000 certification, and then you will get a job at Meta or at Microsoft or at Google next week. And it was never a thing. And like, there's numbers that we see at WeAreDevelopers right now where it's like people are actually really having a hard time finding talent, because they have to sift through those people that basically just had the certificate, only used abstractions, and basically lived in this world. But this is great for building prototypes. This is great for getting started, for actually building something fast. But when it comes to like larger environments and bigger companies, I just gave a talk about junior developers, and I said, like, in the 25 years that I've worked at different companies professionally, Yahoo, Microsoft, Mozilla, I started 6 projects from scratch. Everything else was basically just maintenance and cleaning old shit out. And basically, that knowledge is not something you learn by taking on a new framework. That's something you learn by looking at other code and knowing how the platform works. And this is not going away. If anything, that maintenance is going to get bigger. This year is going to be a lot of people going into retirement that worked on Fortran and COBOL framework software, and a lot of banks and insurance companies that I know are still using those things. So there's a whole landfill of like really, really bad software out there that needs maintaining by somebody. So if you think you cannot be part of the one of 1,000 React developers to stand out, maybe concentrate on that market. It's not snazzy, it's not fun, it's not like the cool kids thing, but it actually will get you a paycheck, and you can do things in your free time or have a social life on the side. That's also an interesting thing to do.
Yeah. So the bootcamp thing, like, I think there's like validity to doing that, right? Like, this isn't everyone's passion, and I think it's totally valid that it can just be a job. Like you can turn up, you can do the work, and you can go home is like a very like totally valid thing, right? But yeah, like a lot of people will go through like a computer science degree or spend a lot of time working their way up the career ladder, like to enter into a senior role requires some level of input and some level of knowledge, and so you can get that through like computer science degrees. You're not going to get that from a boot camp, but you are going to potentially get your way to an entry-level job, and that's a totally fine stepping stone. But the question is like, where do you go from there? And yeah, you're totally right. There's going to be a lot of code that isn't the kind of stuff taught in boot camps, and it's not potentially not the stuff that's taught in CS degrees. That is just like kind of groundwork, kind of, you know, the janitorial work of like maintaining legacy code bases. Learning to navigate those big code bases is like a skill in of itself. That's potentially a specialization that you can focus on, right?
Cool. Well, let's focus on getting a pint in and actually getting and doing something else. It was great to talk to you, and I think we're going to do more because this is really fun, and it's an endless thing. I think there's so many cool things. It would be fun to get like a React like proponent in and basically saying like, hey, like you're talking total bollocks here. Like, what here's 10,000 proofs that it can be done. I think it's an interesting bit, and I think it's also fun that. No, I'm not going to go through it. We could talk for hours, because I was just wondering, like, is there any framework that got really big that didn't start in a large company? That's an interesting question as well. Like, because by making lots of React developers, Meta also made a lot of people dependent on Meta. Yes. So that's something to remember as well. So I think jQuery was the last one that came out of nowhere and came from one person and became like the winner. Because back then I worked on YUI and I thought it was the better solution, but it was too brainy or too academic, because it came with huge documentation rather than like, here's 5 lines of code that do the stuff that you should be doing. But yeah, it's an interesting bit that there's a lot of like there's probably like a veneer of like, hey, the company X does it and we build it for ourselves, so if you want to be professional like us, you have to use it. And not everybody is building Facebook. So probably the issues that React solved for Facebook is not going to be an issue in your personal blog or in the ticket selling site that your website, that your company has with 50 users. So that scale dream is always one thing that always cracks me up as well. If you use this, scaling is built in by default. And you're like, eh.
It's the same with like Kubernetes and stuff, right? It's like it exists across the entire industry, is this idea of operating at the scale of these trillion-dollar companies. Yeah, it's fascinating. One can dream. Maybe writing a React app will get you to the point of being a trillion-dollar company. I think that it's the other way around more than that, but yeah.
But I have to say I'm happy being a developer that's been around for 25 years and got the salary and is not a trillion-dollar company. Maybe my dreams are lower, but like, I don't know. Like, I mean, then again, leaving Microsoft America and going to Germany and telling them my salary that I had before was also a shock to the system for a lot of people. So there's like the middle ground of like trying to find happiness in just, okay, what do I need to spend where I live, rather than like, how much money do I earn because I should get the same that a guy in San Francisco gets, because he spends 80% of his salary on his rent.
Yeah, right. It's chasing numbers, and like, what good's a number in a bank when you can, you know, I live in socialist Europe, right? We have affordable or free healthcare. That's more important to me. I don't want my neighbors getting sick. I'm quite happy paying tax so that my neighbors are free of illness and well educated, at least in theory.
Talking of which, that worked with us. So I thank you very much for this. This was great. So this was Coffee with Developers with Keith Cirkle. We're going to be circling back on that in the near future. And thanks very much. This was great.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.